So Mill is trying to determine what the first principle or fundamental principle of morality is. And he's trying to do this because, in his view, that principle will give us a criterion or a test of right and wrong. And with such a test, we'll be able to determine rationally what, in fact, is right and wrong. We'll be able to do things like resolve the abortion debate or resolve other social, political issues, and so on, right? We'll be able to figure out what actually is right or wrong. Now, Mill thinks Kant had tried to do something similar. Kant had tried to give an account of the fundamental principle of morality, and Mill thought Kant's account didn't work. The formula of universal law was not an adequate fundamental, was not actually the fundamental principle of morality. So, what is the fundamental principle of morality, according to Mill? He calls it the greatest happiness principle. He'll also call it the principle of utility. The greatest happiness principle, that's the first principle of morality. That's the fundamental principle of morality. That's your source of moral obligation. That's your criterion of right and wrong. What is it? Mill says the greatest happiness principle claims that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. That's the greatest happiness principle. And now what we're going to try to do is understand what exactly it's saying. I trust that you'll find it a bit more intuitive or clear than Kant's formula of universal law, or at the very least, it's not as difficult to understand as Kant's formula of universal law. Now, first thing I want to mention, greatest happiness principle, and happiness shows up, right? You got to promote happiness, and you don't want to thwart it or produce the reverse of it. Well, happiness, we've been talking about happiness quite a bit this semester, and in particular, we saw that Aristotle really focused on happiness. Aristotle thought happiness was just kind of the end all and be all of ethics, and so is Mill. We were talking about Mill's education, and he knew Aristotle. He'd read Aristotle. Is Mill just Aristotle? Is this greatest happiness principle just a kind of somehow a statement of Aristotle's position? No, it's not. It's Mill seems to think it was, but everybody besides Mill thinks Mill's wrong about that. And the reason why the greatest happiness principle, at least the main reason, one of the reasons why the greatest happiness principle is not simply a statement of Aristotelian ethics, is because Mill, recall Aristotle. He's very clear about what exactly he means by happiness. According to Aristotle, happiness is virtuous, rational activity. And other people go wrong. Other people say happiness is wealth, and that's not right. Other people say happiness is pleasure. That's not right. Other people say happiness is virtue. That's not quite right. It's virtuous, rational activity, according to Aristotle. So what does Mill mean by happiness? Pleasure. Mill is very clear about this. By happiness, Mill continued, this is right after the greatest happiness principle, right after he states it. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain in the privation of pleasure. Right? The reverse of happiness is pain. Happiness is pleasure. The reverse of happiness is pain. What does that mean? That means Mill's a hedonist. We saw hedonism when we were looking at Locke. Mill and Locke agree about this much, at least. Mill thinks that all and only pleasure is good, all and only pain is evil. Mill is a hedonist. And so when he says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, what Mill is really saying is that actions are right in proportion as they tend to produce pleasure, promote pleasure, wrong as they tend to produce pain. That's Mill's claim. And so it's Mill's hedonism that really distinguishes, or that's maybe one of the primary distinguishing factors between Mill and Aristotle. Aristotle explicitly rejects hedonism. Well, then that might make you think, is Mill, just like Locke, right? They're hedonists, and Locke's British and Mill's British, so maybe, I don't know, maybe Mill had a thing for Locke, and so maybe Mill's just Locke. Is he just Locke? No, he's not. Recall that for Locke, happiness just is pleasure, but that has nothing to do with morality, according to Locke, right? Your happiness might lie in immoral behavior, according to Locke. That doesn't mean you should go and pursue happiness, though. If it's immoral, right? If assaulting people made you happy, according to Locke, and that's a possibility in Locke's view, that doesn't mean you should go assault people. Why? Because there's this moral law. God has set down this law of nature, this moral law, and if you break it, you go to hell, and if you keep it, you go to heaven. And you can just see when you have the idea of God and yourself in mind, you just can see that, oh, I shouldn't break his law. If he gives me a command, I got to follow it, right? That was Locke. Mill doesn't have any of that. There's none of this stuff about the moral law. There's none of this stuff about God setting down a law. Mill is a consequentialist. He states that, or this idea of consequentialism comes out when he claims that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Actions are right, are morally right. The greatest happiness principle is a fundamental principle of morality. It's a principle concerned with what actions are morally right. And Mill is saying that actions are morally right when they promote happiness, when they produce overall good consequences. Consequentialism is a made-up word, made up by philosophers. It's a word that picks out certain kinds of ethical theories, Mill's being one of them. Consequentialism holds that an action is morally right if and only if it maximizes good consequences. Consequentialist, and so Mill is very clearly a consequentialist, because what he's saying is that actions are morally right if and only if they maximize good consequences, the good consequences being pleasure, right? Actions are morally right if they maximize pleasure, if they produce more pleasure than pain. That's the greatest happiness principle. Now, consequentialism differs diametrically from Kant. Kant and consequentialists are often pitted against each other as kind of arch enemies. And the way to see this is to focus on Kant's second proposition of morality. The second proposition of morality says something like actions that are morally praiseworthy have their moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by them, that is to say, not in the consequences or results of the action, but in the maxim according to which it's determined. That's Kant. And so in Kant's view, consequences don't matter for the moral rightness or wrongness of an action, for the moral worth of an action. All that matters is the intention, according to Kant. Mill is taking the exact opposite view. According to Mill, the intentions don't matter at all. He doesn't state that directly, but that's very clearly implied by the greatest happiness principle. The intention doesn't really make it moral or immoral. What makes an action moral or immoral are the consequences it produces. And so if you, and we'll look at some details of this in just a second. So that's Mill's view. And so Mill differs from Kant diametrically on the second proposition in particular. Now, a kind of further difference that's related to this. A little background with Kant. We never talked about this explicitly with Kant, but, we kind of did. Recall perfect duties from Kant. Kant thinks that if a maxim fails his four-step test at the third step, you have a perfect duty not to act on it, right? So something like suicide or lying, those maxims fail at the third step. You have a perfect duty not to act on them. That is to say, it is always impermissible to lie, according to Kant. There is an absolute prohibition on lying, according to Kant, right? That's the result of failing the third step. And so for Kant, there are these absolute prohibitions. But for Mill, there are not. Nothing is absolutely prohibited, according to Mill, because any action you can think of might, in some admittedly strange circumstances, might maximize good consequences, right? So something like lying, for example, Kant wants to say that's always wrong, regardless of the consequences it produces. Whereas Millwood thinks that lying is typically wrong. It's usually wrong. You really shouldn't lie, because typically lying produces bad consequences. It produces more pain than pleasure. But in certain circumstances, lying might produce more pleasure than pain. And for someone like Mill, a consequentialist, the result would be, well, yeah, in that circumstance, lying is permissible. And this can be said for anything. Murder, right? In most cases, killing an innocent person is going to produce far more pain than pleasure. And we'll talk about this in just a second. So in the vast majority of circumstances, murder is wrong, but not in every circumstance, according to Mill, right? In some circumstances, it might be permissible. Nothing is in principle always impermissible, according to Mill, according to consequentialists. That's a further difference between Mill and Kant. Now, what is this word utilitarianism? Well, it's just the name of Mill's ethical theory, really. But one way to think about utilitarianism is that it's just the combination, the conjunction of hedonism and consequentialism. You take hedonism, you take consequentialism, and put them together, and you get utilitarianism, which is the moral theory that Mill thinks is true. So consequentialism, as we've just been talking about, says an action is morally right if it maximizes good consequences. That leaves open the question of what the good consequences are. What are the things that we're trying to maximize? Hedonism gives an answer to that. It says pleasure. That's the good consequence you're going to focus on, right? There are other kinds of consequentialists. There are consequentialists who aren't hedonists. There are consequentialists who think there are things that are good besides pleasure. They wouldn't be utilitarians. They'd be consequentialists, but they wouldn't be utilitarians, right? So some consequentialists think virtue is good, and its goodness is not reducible to pleasure. Or they think friendship is good, and the goodness of friendship is not reducible to pleasure, and so on. And so they would say, yeah, maximize consequences, maximize friendship, maximize virtue, maximize pleasure. There are people who are going to say, yeah, there are all kinds of good consequences. You want to maximize all of them, right? That person wouldn't be a hedonist. They wouldn't be a utilitarian. This is a fairly subtle point, but it gives you a sense of the difference between utilitarianism and consequentialism, and the difference that hedonism makes, right? So if you're a consequentialist and a hedonist, then you're a utilitarian. Okay. So that's Mill's ethical theory. That's it, pretty much. That's the greatest happiness principle. What I want to do now is go through a couple examples so we understand how exactly it works. First example we're going to look at, murdering your arch enemy. Murdering a guy, right? That's kind of the more general thing. You might think, well, look, Mill, yeah, he agrees with, Locke about this hedonism stuff. But Locke pointed out that, people might take pleasure in really bad things. And so Locke's account of moral good and evil kind of takes care of that, right? It takes care of that problem that we ran into. But Mill's getting rid of all that. He's not going to talk about the law of nature, the divine law. He's not going to have God giving us law or anything like that. And so you might worry, well, Mill's going to run into this problem then. And here's a specific example of it. Look, if it gives you pleasure to murder your arch enemy, it looks like Mill's going to say, yeah, go for it, right? Do what's pleasant. And if you really hate that guy, yeah, murder him, right? That might be a worry that you have about utilitarianism. Let's see why that doesn't actually pose any kind of problem. So the worry would be that that his theory would justify murdering your archenemy in this case. Yeah. And if his theory justifies that, well, then that theory is obviously false. Any moral theory that justifies murdering is, just murdering a guy because you don't like him, well, is clearly false. And so if utilitarianism implies that, it's false. So let's see how utilitarianism doesn't imply that. So we're going to start a kind of tally here. Now, Mill doesn't think we can quantify pleasure in kind of precise units, like 5 units of pleasure or anything like that. He doesn't think that. But for the sake of illustration, I'm going to do that just to give us, it'll make the example proceed a little bit more easily. So we're going to start tallying up the pleasure and pain that's going to be the result of murdering your archenemy. So if you murder your archenemy, you'd get pleasure from it. That's what we were just talking about. 10 units of pleasure. Look, does that mean Mill thinks, yeah, go murder people? Well, no, it doesn't. That counts in favor of murdering your archenemy, but you have to look at all the consequences. You don't just look at the consequences for yourself, although they're relevant, but you look at the consequences kind of across the board. Your pleasure and pain counts for sure, yeah, but so does everybody else's, right? And so you have to look at your arch enemy's pleasure/pain. And your arch enemy is obviously going to be very pained by being murdered, right? And so call that -100. But you don't just look at the perpetrator and the victim. You also have to consider other people. Everybody gets a vote, so to speak. Everybody counts. All the results count. And your arch enemy's family and friends and so on. They are not going to individually perhaps feel as much pain as your arch enemy does. But when you add it all up, maybe your arch enemy's spouse feels, like 40 units of pain, and then their parents feel 20, and then other people feel 1, and right? You add it all up, it's going to be significant. Do the same thing across society, right? A fellow citizen has just been murdered. That's going to mildly disturb everyone who hears about it. And you add all that up, right? It's still not going to be that much, but it's still going to be something. It's a lot of people you're adding up there, right? And a little tiny amount of pain across a lot of people is going to add up to a significant amount of pain. But like I was saying, everyone's voice counts. And so you don't just stop there, right? There are other people who might be happy that that guy's dead. And so you add them into the mix, right? So the idea is just you have to add everything into the mix. And now we'll total it all up. And look, -200, that's a whole lot of pain, right? But to really determine whether or not it's moral or immoral to murder your archenemy, you have to consider the alternative. And the alternative to you murdering your archenemy would be you not murdering your archenemy. And well, look, if you don't murder your archenemy, you're going to be a little bit pained, right? You really don't like that guy. And so if he's still drawing breath, that's going to put you in a bad mood. So that counts. That counts. -3. But that's it. That's going to be the only real result. And so our the options before us, right? We're considering murdering our arch enemy. Ultimately, our options boil down to these two. You either, you're going to murder him or you're not. If you don't, you're going to produce -3 units of pain. That's no good. But if you do, you're going to produce -200 units of pain. Well, that's way worse. According to utilitarianism, you are morally obligated to produce the lesser amount of pain, right? You're supposed to promote happiness, and anything that promotes the reverse is immoral. Given that these are the two options before us, even though the one only, we have kind of two bad options. All we have before us is producing pain. We don't have an option before us of producing pleasure. That's fine. Nonetheless, picking the one where we don't murder the archenemy promotes pleasure. It promotes happiness in as much as it produces less of the reverse of happiness. And so utilitarianism would say, no, you're morally obligated to refrain from murdering your archenemy. Something like that is the idea, right? So it gets the right answer. It's not just do whatever makes you happy. That's not what utilitarianism is saying. And indeed, utilitarianism might require you to sacrifice your own happiness. Your happiness counts just as much as other people's happiness counts. And if some action that you might perform produces a lot of happiness for other people while making you pained, well, utilitarianism has said you're morally obligated to perform that action, even though it only brings pain to you, right? That's utilitarianism. Okay, second example, let's look at actually kind of like a real example. Using CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons is what CFC stands for. Just a little background on what this is. CFCs are used in refrigerators. It's a chemical that helps refrigerators and air conditioners run. And when you use a refrigerator and air conditioner, CFCs are released into the air. It's like a kind of a gas. And that gas rises. It's lighter than the air. And so it rises and rises and rises, and it rises out into the ozone layer. And when it gets out to the ozone layer, the ultraviolet radiation from the sun causes the CFCs to break down, and they release a chlorine atom, and that chlorine atom combines with the ozone, which degrades it, which is what causes the hole in the ozone layer, right? The hole in the ozone layer, I believe, last I checked, it was getting smaller if it hadn't completely disappeared. But I don't know, 20 years ago, there was a big hole in the ozone layer. That's a big problem because that lets in more ultraviolet radiation, which causes cancer. So that's a big problem. So we don't want a big hole in the ozone layer. CFCs do that. But CFCs are also part of refrigeration and air conditioning, and that's really pleasant and nice. Right, so if we use CFCs, we're gonna, it's really nice to have refrigerated food and to have air conditioning in the summer, especially if it's really hot and humid or whatever, right? And so if we use CFCs, we'd be pleased as a result. Now, there's an alternative called HCFCs. And so refrigerators and air conditioners and so on, I think maybe, I can't, aerosol bottles had the same, I can't remember. We can run those things using a slightly different chemical, HCFCs. But in order to, you can think of it like this, imagine we're like 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and everyone's refrigerators now, air conditioners now use HCFCs. But back in the day, prior to the switch, in order to switch, you would have to buy a new refrigerator. You'd have to buy a new air conditioner. And so if we switch to HCFCs, we'd still be pleased as a result. We'd still have refrigeration and air conditioners and so on. But we'd be slightly less pleased because we'd have to spend some money, right? And we don't want to do that. That's not fun. We'd have to spend some money on a new refrigerator, on a new air conditioner, and so on. So we'd still, on net, have pleasure, experience pleasure, but just not as much because there are certain costs involved with that switch. And so what's utilitarianism going to say? Use CFCs? Well, look, CFCs have 200, HCFCs have 150. The result seems to be, keep on using the CFCs. But you might think that's the wrong answer because so here's the crucial difference. HCFCs don't degrade the ozone layer, right? And so, look, I don't know. We should clearly use HCFCs even though it imposes a cost on us because that's going to mitigate this depletion of the ozone layer. But it looks like utilitarianism can't get the right result. It looks like it says, no, just keep using CFCs because there's a cost involved with the switch to HCFCs. But utilitarianism doesn't get the wrong result because you have to look at all of the pleasure and pain that's produced. You have to look at people in the future. People in the future, if we continue using CFCs, are going to get cancer or are going to be more likely to get cancer. And getting cancer, they're going to be more likely to die prematurely. And this is going to cause pain to them, their loved ones, in society, especially because, oh, we could have avoided it or whatever, right? There's going to be a lot of pain in the future if we just keep on plugging away using CFCs, because we're going to open up this hole in the ozone, which leads to cancer and pain and misery and so on. Whereas if we switch to HCFCs, we're not going to produce all that much more cancer in the future, right? It's just going to be, no, we're not going to create this problem for ourselves. So you have to take everything into account, including future pleasures and pains. And then you total up the pleasure and pain produced by your action. And when you do it like this, well, the result is clear, right? Utilitarianism would hold that society, us, we are morally required to make this switch from the HCFCs, from CFCs to HCFCs. Why? Because doing so promotes happiness, promotes pleasure. If we just keep going away, if we just keep using CFCs, well, that's going to produce all kinds of misery and pain. And by taking into account these people in the future, you can see how utilitarianism, or at least a certain variant of utilitarianism, the one we're considering, would try to deal with issues like global warming, right? The hole in the ozone layer is not global warming. It's a slightly different issue, but it's, a lot of the mechanisms or the general idea is somewhat similar, right? You have to take into account the future as well, that pleasure and pain. It counts, it would seem, just as much as ours does, right? And so we can see again, utilitarianism gets the intuitively correct answer.